What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Your Golden Buddha. Today, we're going to talk about our most recent blog post, Thinking Greater Than You Feel. Now, what if I told you that confident, healthy, thriving version of you wasn't something that you waited for, but something that you could become right now? Now, there's a study done in 1979 that completely changed how I look at this. So, in this, they took a group of elderly gentlemen and they had them go on a retreat for just 1 week. Now, during this retreat, they were told to pretend like they were living in 1959, a full 20 years prior. So everything at the retreat, the furniture, the music, the magazines, whatever was around them, was as if it was from 20 years ago. And if they wanted to see a picture of themselves now, or they wanted to see themselves in the mirror, instead they were shown a picture of themselves 20 years ago. Now, what's interesting is they truly were believing that they were 20 years younger. And at the end of this, they were asked how they felt on a whole host of different levels. Not only did they show that they were stronger, they had improved joint flexibility, but they also scored higher on intelligence tests, their vision improved. There was a whole host of things that happened. And so this showed that their belief led to a literal biological change. That is amazing to me because that just shows how our beliefs not only shape our perception of the world around us, but can actually shape us as people. So what does thinking greater than you feel mean? It means acting from the version of you that you want to become, rather than the version of you that you were. So most of us act based on how we feel, but feelings are often old habits. They're wired into our nervous system and your body feels tired, so you must think, oh, I slept poorly. Or I feel unsure, so I must not be ready for this moment. But the thing is that's looking to our past. That's allowing our previous conditioning, our previous experiences to dictate how we feel. And so instead, we must look to the future. We must look to who we want to become. And so what if your feelings aren't facts, but they're actually just familiarity? Our brains are constantly looking for that. They're looking for familiar because that means we're safe. That's why we have so many routines and processes. That's because our brains need that in order to feel safe. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to improve, or more importantly, that those processes or those routines are what's best for us. I mean, think of your friend who just keeps getting into the same crappy relationship over and over again. Now, the reason why they're doing this isn't because, hey, this is the best thing for them. It's instead because their brain thinks this is the most familiar and therefore the safest. And so familiarity doesn't necessarily mean the best, but it actually just means safe to our brains. And that's something that we need to start to understand a little bit better if we want to start rewiring how our brain works. So there's this science behind identity rehearsal. What's incredible is our brains can't tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And so we can practice becoming this version of ourselves before we actually have the evidence for that. And then our brain will look back on these visualizations, this imagination, and think, hey, this is a real thing. This actually happened. And so now we have proof all of a sudden. And I call this emotional method acting. And it allows us to fully take over this character, this future version of ourselves, this one that is confident, it's healthy, it's thriving. Everything's working out for them. They live an abundant life. Money flows easily into their life. Everything works out for them. They're just so lucky. And we envision that person to be us now. So we take a look at that life and we think, what would that person be thinking? What would that person be doing? And as we do this, we start figuring out the habits, the thinking patterns of what this future version could be. So someone who thinks they're always lucky, if they're anxious about a situation, about how something's going to work out, they're not going to be worried about it anymore because instead they're going to be thinking, hey, things always work out for me. Everything's going to work out for the best. Or someone who's relaxed under pressure isn't going to be so worried about what's going on around them. They're going to be more focused about the internal calm within them. And so these little thinking habits, these little patterns are things that we can pick up on our own and start integrating into our everyday life. So you can start asking questions like, how would this person walk into a room? If they're confident, they're going to stand tall. When they sit down, they're going to sit down with purpose. And when they interact with people around them, they're not going to be fidgeting and moving around nervously. Instead, they're going to be calm, cool, and collected within themselves. Now our body starts to take this as fact. Our body starts to think, hey, this is actually what we're like. And over time, we start to rewire those little patterns. And so you can also think, hey, what tone would they use when something goes wrong? If we're in an argument with someone, our most normal reaction is to snap back at them, to get aggressive, to try and prove our point. But this other version of you might think, hey, it's not me versus them, it's me and them versus the problem. So rather than snapping back at the person, you might take a couple deep breaths and say, all right, how can we address this? How can we figure out a way to collaborate on this rather than compromise in one way or another or argue with each other? And these little habits start becoming fact again. You can ask, what's their self-talk after a tough day? What's their self-talk when they succeed? If you make a mistake or there's a failure in your life, rather than being like, my self-worth is nothing, like I'm not deserving of success. Instead, this person would be thinking, hey, what can we learn from this? How can we grow? How can we become a better version of ourselves? And that starts changing everything, because once our self-talk change, then our habits, our routines, and the way we look at the world changes too. What's interesting is that over time, you're going to find more and more proof that you're already this person. And that's what's the most incredible thing. Your brain starts to pick up on these little tiny habits, these little experiences that maybe you glossed over at first, but now you pay attention to it and you think, hey, that person cut me off in traffic today, but I was a little calmer when that happened. Instead, I was focused on the music rather than laying on the horn. And so I actually had an experience a couple weeks ago where I had a doctor's appointment. And in this, I had done a bunch of lab work, got a bunch of tests done, and I was hoping for some really positive results. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I still tested positive for so many different Lyme-related things. It sucked. And at first, I was bummed out. I let myself feel the emotions. I let myself feel sad. But then in a couple minutes, all of a sudden, that voice in the back of my head started saying something different. Normally, it would be saying, hey, this isn't going to work. You're never going to get better. This is what life is going to be like forever. You're always going to be living your life in bed. It said, this moment is helping you become the version of you that you're meant to become. It started helping me realize that all of these things happen for a reason. I started thinking about how I'm lucky. I started thinking about all these positive things that I wouldn't have thought about before. But now with this mental training, it became my natural progression of thought. And this didn't happen all at once. That wasn't just a random thought. That was weeks and months and years of training my subconscious mind to look for the positives in things. Look to being the version of me that I want to be in those situations. So rather than feel hopeless and feeling like nothing's going to work out for me, I felt like, hey, this is a redirection, but maybe there's something else that I can work on during this. Maybe there's something else I'm meant to learn. And so rather than looking at the negatives, I started focusing on what's going well for me. Now, this was a huge turning point for me because this was the first time this felt like me. And it took months for me to feel like this. It took months for me to have these examples. But as I've been doing this more and more, I've started noticing more and more examples. And last year at the state championship golf tournament, I came off the last green and my dad told me, hey, it just doesn't look like you're trying to make any of those putts. It doesn't look like you believe you can make any of those long putts. He said from inside 5-10 feet, it looks like you're confident. It looks like you're sure of yourself. But I can tell from your body language that any distance further than that, you just don't believe that you can make the putts. And at first I was kind of pissed off because I was like, what does he know about any of this? Like, he's not much of a golfer. He plays once or twice a year, typically with me. And how does he know how I'm feeling about these putts? And so I sat with it for a moment, and rather than snap back at him, I was like, okay, let's process this and let's see if any of this is true. And so the next day I went out there and I was like, I'm going to walk into every single putt with as much confidence as I can and just be fully self-assured that I'm going to make this putt. I'm not going to focus about the next shot. I'm just focused on this one. And what's interesting is I had the best putting round of my life. I started making everything. Now, not only was I making everything, I also believed I could make everything. So every single time I got over the ball, I felt confident. I felt good. Rather than under pressure and my hands shaking, I felt self-assured. It was like that extra energy of the nerves was helping me focus more. And so unknowingly, my dad was helping me train thinking greater than you feel. And so at first, I didn't feel like I could make those putts. He was absolutely right. But over time, I started learning that if I just pretended like I had the confidence to make those putts, that I would. And so I took this and started applying it to other areas of my life. I started applying it to not just golf, but my relationships, and most importantly, everything revolving around my health. Because as you know, when you're sick, that kind of takes up everything around you. It changes your perspective. It's the lens through which you're viewing the world. And so I realized my focus was so heavily on, oh gosh, how am I feeling today? What's going on? And now all of a sudden I was waking up and I was telling myself, I feel terrific. I feel amazing. I feel smart. I feel energetic. I feel ready to tackle the day. And what's interesting is the days that I typically would spend in bed and I would feel depressed, I'd feel anxious. Instead, I'd get out of bed, I would go to the library across the street, and I'd just start doing some writing, or I'd read there. And I tell myself, here, look, there's an example of me being a thriving member of the community. Look at me, I'm reading, I'm writing, I'm doing all these things, I'm doing it in public rather than from my bed. And so for me, that was a huge improvement. And it all started with thinking greater than you feel on the golf course. And it worked its way into other areas of life. And you'll notice the same thing is going to happen with you. So you don't need to meditate in a cave for a year. You don't need to go on a retreat for a week. Most of us don't have that option. Instead, what we can do is use life as a training ground to help us become the person that we want to become. And this happens through tiny little micro moments through the day and pausing and allowing ourselves to understand who we want to be in that moment. And you'll notice that over time, your life will change. I think that's one of the coolest things about thinking greater than you feel. So thanks for tagging along today, guys. Like and subscribe and check out our other channels on Instagram and Spotify. Head over to the website to subscribe to the blog, and I'll see you guys soon. Thanks and take care.